Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
Hello and welcome back to the Unpack podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Timo Daily, and I am joined, as always, by my more than capable co-hosts, Jesse Billington and Ellie Mae Taylor. How are you both this evening?
I'm not too bad. Nothing much to say from my end of things, but I think Ellie Mae's got something to say.
I'm very tired. Spent the day with Girls on Track, basically helping 100 girls sort of earn, how do you sort of say it, get into sort of the media side of things of motorsport.
Showing them the ropes for how to get into motorsport.
Yeah, sort of being in charge of that, which means my brain is now fried, but it did make me laugh halfway through the day when every other girl was saying girl like I say girl, and suddenly I wasn't a minority.
All of a sudden you met other people with a slightly Bristolian accent.
I'm sure when they wanted you to be an influence on them, that's not quite the way they meant it to, but you took it and ran with it, I'm sure.
Pretty much, yeah. I may have influenced them, I may have traumatized them, but at least we all say girl the right way.
Like you're someone out of the Wurzels. Fantastic.
We're back, of course, though, to review all the action from this weekend's Singapore Grand Prix, as well as take a look at some of the news that's come out of the world of F1 in the past week. And with that in mind, Ellie, we're going to come straight to you first for what the hell has happened, because we do have a bit of driver news.
Yes, Zhou has had his contract renewed for next year with what will then be Sauber. I guess this is no doubt probably partially down to creating more stability whilst the transition from sort of Alfa Romeo to Sauber to Audi takes place. The last thing they want at the moment is to introduce a new driver to the team and it not work out. So in renewing Zhou's contract, they have a driver that they can trust. They can trust to get the job done, and that's probably why they've kept him too. He's doing a good job this season in what's not the best car on the grid. What do you guys think about Alfa Romeo / Sauber keeping him on?
I think there's the 3-season rule at play there, where let's see how he does next year. I mean, we don't know how much they're going to develop that car for the rest of this year or next year. They're definitely looking at 26 for the next major push when Audi comes into it. And if he doesn't perform next year, in theory, they could get Porsche for 25, have a year of just bedding him in and get him used to everything for them to hopefully then capitalize on the new regs in 26. And he's not a complete rookie by then. Alternatively, you stick with Zhou for 25 and you've got two potentially experienced drivers in the car for 26. And either way, you're pretty solid in theory. It's just the car then that needs to be upgraded. So if that side of things ain't broke, don't fix it, I guess.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think they're possibly at risk of wasting a Théo Pourchaire with this one. He's going to be sat on the sidelines for another season because essentially they've also got Bottas lined up to basically sign a contract at this point, I believe, is the way that things are panning out. So that Alfa Romeo seat is going to be signed and sealed, and Pourchaire is with a pretty good shot of winning the Formula 2 title this season. So he's going to have nowhere to go bar looking at either reserve positions or doing what's becoming an increasingly common, popular and enjoyable pastime for Formula 2 drivers with no place else to go, which is go and do IndyCar. Seats are cropping up more and more and more there as they open up more and more cars for each team. I think there was read news earlier that there's literally a fifth car arriving at another team earlier today. So
Chip Ganassi.
Yeah, there's going to be a fifth Chip Ganassi.
Which I love that they can just do that, by the way. It's like, yeah, Kevin Simpson, wants to come and join for us. Why not? Let's just add a car to it. You just don't get that normally.
And if you've got the talent of Théo Pourchaire moving over to do that, I think a fairly savvy IndyCar team would sort of bring him in, put him in that sort of rookie of the year category and see what happens. And we've seen great things come from, what's the little Kiwi fellow?
In IndyCar. Marcus Armstrong?
That's the one. Yeah. He's done pretty well this season as coming in as a rookie and has performed very well and has had a pretty good season of it. And Callum Ilott has really found his feet in the sport, both of them coming from Formula 2 into IndyCar.
And Christian Lundgaard won his first race in his second season of IndyCar this year, obviously a Formula 2 ilk himself.
Yes, yeah, you sort of forget him. He's very sort of under the radar driver, but again, proving that there is life to be had if your chosen F1 team completely ignores you. And yeah, I think they're Alfa Romeo are at risk of throwing away a good talent if they don't offer him something competitive or at least something interesting with a good promise of a drive somewhere down the line. I think that's where this stems from. But
the last thing to note on that, I think, is the fact that Pourchaire is also really young still in the grand scheme of things. So Andretti, in theory, if he went over to IndyCar a bit, they could look at him and then maybe scout him as one of their drivers when they come in 26. Assuming that all goes ahead, which we're just going to assume is happening at this point. And that's not a bad idea either. It's a curious one from Sauber because, again, we've said this many times on the podcast that we're just not sure what they're doing at the moment, aside from just killing time between now and Audi arriving.
Do you think that, I mean, it's hard to sort of predict, but do you think Pourchaire would do a better job than Zhou? Or do you think, drivers sort of like Zhou Guanyu and Logan Sargent, they're doing an okay job, but is that okay job, should that keep them in Formula One?
I think it's a little bit like Yuki Tsunoda. We've not had a teammate with either. Well, you have with Sargent, I'd say, because Albon is definitely the superior driver there, but Bottas hasn't proven to be as superior to Zhou as we maybe expected him to be, which then you wonder about the car, but then you wonder, it'd be interesting to see if you did put Pourchaire in the car for a few races, what he could do with it. But that's just not going to happen unless there's an injury of some kind for one of the drivers. So it is a tricky one to predict there. I think it's similar to the AlphaTauri situation of maybe there just isn't a driver in that other car that has been able to give us a clear measurement of what the car is capable of yet.
You've not got this great sort of baseline to work against. It's an unpredictable and tricky chassis to work with. And Bottas hasn't exactly had a fantastic season of it so far. So it's not exactly like this year you've got a great baseline to go from. Last year wasn't an exceptional year either for the team. So far you've had two fairly low to middling years to even try and base this guy's career off. It's a third season for him is great because it gives him a third and final chance to really show what he's made of and what he can do. But ultimately, I think he's starting to be a bit hamstrung by the machinery and appreciates that there's these external pressures of other drivers that are coming up the ranks that he has previously raced against. I believe he did drive against Théo Pourchaire in Théo's first season. It would have been Zhou's last. And so he knows what Théo is capable of on track, and that sort of has that as a very real threat in the back of his mind. It's an interesting conundrum to face, and I think it's one where the ever swelling ranks of IndyCar might be an ever growingly appealing proposition.
Something that's a bit more straightforward to deal with is Helmut Marko, because going off the back of what I addressed in the preview to the Singapore Grand Prix, he's been given a written warning by the FIA for his comments about Perez. And I want to ask you two, does a written warning actually do anything for someone like Helmut Marko? Would some other kind of punishment, such as, I don't know, financial penalty or visible punishment, e.g. don't be a racist class thing, go and do that maybe? Because it just seems that this is something that isn't obviously the first time it's happened with Marko. And obviously 2023, really, we still get this, and Horner's statement was very vanilla, I think, in terms of obviously he's not going to lay into Marko, but it didn't seem the most convincing kind of statement either from what I read from it. So I'd be interested to get your thoughts on that one quickly before we get into Singapore.
I think Horner was hamstrung on what he could say, because it's crucial to remember that Marko is not a Red Bull Racing employee. Yeah. He is a Red Bull employee.
Catch-22 thing.
Yeah, he comes from the rank above Horner. So Horner, while he could have taken a strong line against it and clearly sort of says that there is no place for that level of racism or intolerance within the sport and within the team, yeah, you can say that. I don't think that with regards to his career, he felt comfortable taking a stronger line. When it comes to Formula One or the FIA coming down on this, I think that that's an interesting one. I think a written warning shows that they have they are aware that this is a behavior that needs to be dealt with. which is good. It shows an awareness of it and the fact that they have an appreciation that this needs to be sort of addressed. But at the end of the day, we've seen similar behavior from Marko before. I think at this point it is maybe time to give him a bit of a shuffle. His decisions haven't been perfect for a little while. He was the head honcho that decided that we have Nick de Vries join AlphaTauri at the start of this season. And that didn't pay out particularly well. So you've got to really start questioning beyond the immediate incident of him proclaiming that all people from South America are disinterested and badly organized people when it comes to racing drivers, which is flatly false because geographically Mexico is not South American, it's North America. But also the fact that it's just blatantly racist. I think there's so many factors that you need to take into account whether Marko should be retaining a job at Red Bull for his competency, let alone his social ability to integrate with an increasingly modern and diverse grid. Mercedes had
also a little ironic given how successful his own racing career was.
Yeah, I think it was about 3 to 6 entries in the Austrian Grand Prix, and that was about it. But he
did win Le Mans.
Yeah.
Not that I'm trying to back him.
Ellie May.
But the interesting...
I'm not going to get myself into a difficult situation, she says earlier off camera, immediately jumps into the hot water.
But the interesting way of framing it is looking at when they asked Toto Wolff about this and said what position he would take if this was someone from within his organization. And he took a very different and stricter line. And his was more the line I wanted to hear from Christian Horner, which was there is absolutely no place for that sort of behavioral language within my sort of group and organization. And that sort of person would have been sort of shown the door pretty quickly. I think
one final question I want to ask you then is that if it was, if Horner had decided to take a more Toto line to it and be more strict about it, would that have been the worst thing in the world either? Because, okay, he's maybe having to have a go at someone above his station, hierarchically speaking, but isn't there some things where it's worth having that conversation for? Because again, it shows that you're not going to do it for just about anything, and this is a serious situation enough that he's willing to put his neck on the line. They're not going to fire Horner for calling him out on something like this. They need him too much. But it's interesting to see where, if this isn't the line where Horner decides to draw that in the sand as to what he would take up to the next level, what is?
I think this was a media briefing that came from Red Bull down to Red Bull Racing on how to deal with it. But I think at the end of the day, if Horner had made a bigger deal of it and a bigger fuss of it, it's very much that thing of all publicity is good publicity. And this would have been the best example of that because, yes, what Marko did was wrong. But if Horner can prove that Red Bull has no sort of tolerance to this sort of thing, no argument for that level of behavioural language, Red Bull could come out of that absolutely sort of glistening and going, no, that is, with someone going, no, that is 100% unacceptable and we do not stand for that. If they're taking an even stricter line and made a bigger example of him, that would have looked fantastic on Red Bull's record. It's very much that sort of anti-bullying policy at school thing of, no, we do not stand for that.
It's a pretty easy open goal.
Yeah, and it seems that Red Bull did enough, but sort of goofed of not making more of it in the best way possible.
It's almost a bit like the unwritten sort of UK constitution, in that when someone in your political party does something, like your prime minister does something, you don't kind of publicly disagree with them. You might sort of behind the scenes, and you may even tell them that, but you don't go on air and say it. And I think maybe that's also kind of what we are seeing from Red Bull. And we've got to remember that these guys are hugely media trained as well. And you're probably...
You'd be hard pressed to know it some days with Marko, though.
Well, maybe not Helmut Marko, but more sort of Red Bull Racing side of things. And I think unless they were going to make an example of Helmut Marko and sort of push him out, they were never going to say this is totally unacceptable and go down sort of that route. I guess if it doesn't come from Red Bull Racing, I guess it's what will the FIA do? Because remember when Nelson Piquet, it came out that he made those remarks about Lewis Hamilton, he's now banned from entering F1. So it's kind of, if Helmut Marko has now had that written warning, if he makes a remark like that again, what are they also going to do about it?
Yeah, very much.
The last thing I'll say on that is I do wonder if that does happen, are they just hoping that it doesn't, so that they don't then have to figure out what the appropriate countermand is to that, because it puts them in potential trouble, because it's, again, such a high profile figure who's embedded within the sport firmly at the moment. It's not just someone from the past of Formula One, it's someone who's very relevant to it now.
Yeah, it's a tricky one to deal with because he has such an active role. But at the end of the day, I think there was an element of towing the party line to avoid having the whip taken away on Red Bull Racing's behalf, to simply avoid causing a fracas from Red Bull. But yeah, I think we've made our thoughts on that one plain. So we'll dive into the actual action from the weekend, and we'll kick off with practice, which was a triplet of pretty straightforward sessions, but Red Bull seemed off the pace following a new technical directive. TD018 aims to stamp out flexible bodywork, and essentially this means front wings that lay flat back under the airstream at high speeds, stalling out and producing essentially a front-end DRS. Red Bull maintained that this directive wasn't the cause of their woes, though they were sporting a new floor, which didn't seem to gel well with the car's design. The crucial issue here was it didn't actually seem to activate as well as they were anticipating at lower speeds, so they had to lower the car's ride height. And this meant that around the sort of rough and bouncy terrain of the Singapore circuit, that the front end and rear end of the car were both grounding out under braking as the car sort of transferred weight fore and then eventually aft as it settled. It meant that it was grounding out, causing an unstable platform. So they had to run the car a little bit higher to negate that and give them a stable platform under braking, but this meant the car wasn't producing the downforce it expected. So they were pretty hampered throughout the weekend, hoped they could dial it in through qualifying, but unfortunately, qualifying did not pan out how they were anticipating. Lance Strolled it into Q1, in Q1 rather, clipping the curb on the final turn, looping it round and slamming side on into the barriers. A very messy crash.
Mike Crack's defense of Lance Stroll for that. Did you see what he said? You've got to love the team spirit there to try and dig himself, try and dig Stroll out of that one.
I didn't see it. What was it?
He essentially said that this is just proof that Lance Stroll's really got what it takes to compete at a high level, because you've got to have such a high level of commitment to go for it that hard in the last two corners, whereas everyone else thinking, well, you're not going to get the time back that you're missing in. That's just not how that works. You're not going to be able to if I just go quicker here, where I'm not meant to go at this speed, I can then just fix my lap time. And, oh, look, you can't because cargo crash.
Yeah,
so I know he can't come out and necessarily shit on his own driver, but it was just funny that it's like, yeah, I'm going to have to toe the party line here, but just work with me, guys, because we both know that this isn't the case. But just, I got to say it.
Yeah, he can't sort of poo-poo his own driver, nor can he poo-poo the boss's son. So it's, double-edged sword on that one.
It's very much sort of the defense of, well, you can't blame him because he was pushing and a driver's meant to push. That's sort of the defense.
It's just a shame he wasn't pushing sooner in the lap where it counted.
The problem was that he was pushing after he'd essentially overcooked his rear tyres. Going into the final chicane, he'd suffered a snap of oversteer, which would have spiked tyre temperatures and sort of lost him a lot of traction. So as he tips it into that final left-hander, coming onto the start-finish line, the rear end just gave way on him, and that's where we see it snap round on him. He sort of catches it, and then it gets lost on him again because it's already sliding at that point. The tyres are, at that point, null and void. So, yeah, sideways into the barriers he goes. A lot of damage as elements of the car were ripped away. Crucially, though, it did also damage Lance a little bit. He opted to sit out the race following a medical checkup. He was given the green flag after the medical, but opted not to, just because I think he was feeling a bit sort of, not necessarily shaken, but bruised and battered afterwards, which, given the severity of the incident, it spat the car into the air as well. You can understand.
Yeah, not shaken.
But equally, Aston Martin were unable to replace him, even if they were able to rebuild the car. They weren't able to install a Stoffel Van Dorn or Felipe Drugovich, as neither had run that weekend. So they were already racing with one hand behind their back. Lance's incident flew a red flag.
They kind of were already anyway.
Yeah, this just sort of tied
just
and not tighter.
Made it more formal.
Yeah. Lance's incident flew a red flag early in the session and ruined the run of Oscar Piastri, who seemed to have the pace to make it through, especially on a track that was ramping up very quickly. So much so that Yuki had actually topped the times in Q1.
I'll say Yuki and the two Hasses in the top Prix at the end of Q1, and you're just then looking at the screen going, what the hell is happening here? And also, where has this been all season?
It was a track that evolved quickly.
It's annoyingly, but because of how the way that the track was ramping up so quickly, if you looked at where some of the drivers were and some of the times they were pushing in, interestingly, it really saved George Russell, because I don't think George Russell would have got out of Q1 with his time if Lance Stroll hadn't have put it into the barriers.
Yeah, I think George was down towards the drop zone, I think, at that point, and had a few more drivers come through quickly. Certainly Oscar Piastri, he would have been very much in the danger zone. Sainz would go on to...
The one thing we did get from Stroll's excellent memes, which I'm sure both of you have seen.
I haven't seen too many of them, to be fair.
No.
A lot of them are harking back to its pictures of Alonso, Stroll Senior, and Stroll Junior with the caption of Crashgate colorized, and Flavio being there. They're all talking, going, "No, we said crash in the race."
It was very much that case of Alonso somehow who was also quite low down the qualifying order at that point, again at risk of dropping out should one of the drivers behind him come through quickly, benefiting from one of his teammates crashing around Singapore. But we won't speculate too much on that. Sainz would go on to top.
That's Felipe Massa.
Sainz would go on to top Q2 and Q3, and the Red Bulls would suffer with timing trouble and fail to get in ideal laps in the second round of qualifying while battling a recalcitrant car, opening the door for Liam Lawson to knock Verstappen out of the top 10 shootout. Sainz would again top the sheets in Q3 ahead of Russell, with Leclerc gunning from P3. Both Haas cars made it into Q3, first time since Austria last year, I believe. Magnussen P6, Hulkenberg P9, and Zhou would go on to start from the pit lane instead of the back of the grid after taking a new power unit and then further parts under Parc Fermé conditions.
Liam gosh darn Lawson. I mean, how impressive.
It was a biblical drive from him, and yeah, just absolutely stunning stuff.
Anyway.
Didn't Zhou Guanyu, or at least the Alfa Romeos, have upgrades this race as well? So we didn't really see how well they ran. If Zhou was sort of
we potentially did, because they didn't help Zhou make much progress.
Yeah, I think they did have upgrades. I think it was the McLaren and AlphaTauri that had the most significant upgrades this weekend. McLaren really able to reap performance from theirs, and I believe AlphaTauri had a hell of a lot of things thrown at their car, which admittedly only one of them was able to find out. We'll get into that because it all unwound a little bit for AlphaTauri in the race itself. And it was a lights to flag win for Carlos Sainz, proving that sometimes it's not always the fastest driver who wins the race. A very metered drive cemented his position atop the rostrum and helped defend from the hard-charging Mercedes in the final leg, with old teammate Norris as a rear gunner. Logan Sargent triggered an early safety car, which scuppered the Red Bull plans after the American outbraked himself and headbutted the wall, breaking his wing and littering the track with bits of Williams. A slew of drivers would pit under the safety car, including Ferrari, just about pulling off a double stack, with Charles suffering from pit lane traffic on his release. While they didn't pit, the Red Bulls cannoned up the order, but were now sitting ducks on tired old hards and fell back before pitting and falling further. A late safety car gamble by Mercedes saw them drop a little after Esteban Ocon suffered a hydraulic failure and retired at the pit exit. But with fresh tyres, the Mercedes were able to blow through the field ahead, where the top three was Sainz leading Norris, leading Leclerc. The gamble to keep a fresh set of mediums paid off for Mercedes as they blasted past Leclerc. A wily Sainz, though, would keep Norris in his DRS tow to act as a rear gunner while the Mercedes hunted him down, essentially creating his own mini DRS train, which was just enough to keep Mercedes behind and start cooking their tyres, something that would befall Russell later on. And Russell would eventually go on to tap the wall coming into, I think it's turn 10, the left-hander. He'd seen Norris do it the lap before and get away with it. And just as the wall kicks out into the circuit, it broke Russell's suspension, sent him ploughing on into the barriers on the last lap. Hamilton would inherit P3, that final podium position. Verstappen, on his fresher tyres, was able to track down Leclerc on his dead hards, but couldn't make the pass, the two achieving a close finish over the line. Leclerc no doubt praising the work of Lawson, who had put up a strong fight against the pressing Red Bull driver. The DNF
stronger than anything Gasly or the Passes did, I might add. Because you'd think that arguably they're still not going to be able to stay ahead of Verstappen, but they could have probably battled him at least minutely instead of just pulling over to one side. Whereas Lawson, he knew he wasn't going to win that fight, but I think there was part of him was like, I don't know how many races I'm going to get here. I get to fight Verstappen on pace. I'm going to do that for a little bit. Why not?
Yeah, it was a bold call from Lawson. I do commend him for it. The DNFs and the like were a withdrawal for Lance Stroll before the start of the race, a retirement for Yuki Tsunoda on lap 1 following collision damage from Perez. We will come back to this. Retirement for Ocon on lap 42 with a gearbox failure, which was triggered by the hydraulics. It's basically the gearbox operates off hydraulics, which is spun by a pump. The pump died. Bottas retired quietly on lap 51 with a gearbox failure as well. And George was classified as last as he'd completed more than 90% of the race distance, so came home P16. The Yuki Tsunoda retirement I will touch on quickly here because he claimed it was a puncture and it looked like a puncture on the coverage. We saw him get basically slammed into by the first of one of Perez's many dirty overtakes through the weekend. A lot of careless moves from Perez, basically just dive bombing his way down the inside and just sort of hoping that he'd be close to the front axle.
Normally when you hear puncture, you think, well, unless it's proper blown out tyre, you can probably make it back to the pits and you just get a new one. So it's like, what the hell are you retiring for a puncture for?
Yes.
It seemed a little bit sus.
A little bit sus at the time until you look at any of the pictures that came of his AlphaTauri when it did return to the garage, and it had a huge gash along the bottom of the side pod and the floor, essentially where Sergio had somehow, avoiding damage to his car, possibly it would have been wheel to side, what's it called? Side pod contact. I completely forgot the word there. Side pod contact, and it just literally ripped through it and seemed to also sever a variety of lines as well, running through the complex radiator system that sits in there. So that very quickly ended Yuki's race. And I can imagine that the debrief in the combined Red Bull teams sort of offices later would not have been a chipper one for certain. So with the race run through...
He might have just been trying to improve AlphaTauri's performance. He thought, yeah, we can get rid of that. That provides a nice bit of aero for you.
Try and improve its performance. We're going to get rid of Yuki Tsunoda and just let Liam Lawson go ahead and do it because he's clearly the better driver at the moment.
That is a strong argument to use. But with the race run through, we'll dive into our winners and spinners, which have a little more analysis to them. And Ellie May, we'll start with yours.
I've probably gone for the most obvious one, Carlos Sainz. Outstanding performance from him all weekend. He was quick in the free practice sessions and he was able to sort of carry that through to qualifying to take pole and then throughout the race. I mean, during the race, he was constantly thinking about how he could maintain the lead and was intelligent enough to give Norris DRS towards the end so that Norris could defend from Russell, which ultimately forced Russell into an error despite being in the quicker car due to his fresher tyres after pitting to go on the mediums after Ocon put out a virtual safety car. And I think whilst in some respects Carlos never had to fight as such with another driver on track, it was still a mentally and physically tough race for him. He was always having to constantly think about his next move to maintain the lead. And I think he thoroughly deserved the win. I think he has been the best driver all weekend. He sort of was able to really carry the momentum sort of from Monza and sort of make it even sort of better in Singapore.
It was very Alan Prost-like with his use of using the situation to your advantage and essentially saying, who cares which car comes second as long as I finish first. So I can just trust that Lando's not going to go past me because he's not going to risk losing second because we know how hard Sainz can fight. We saw that with Leclerc in Monza. And I think he knew that if he didn't do that, then Mercedes, if they could get past Norris, then they'd be past him in no time at all, regardless of how much he defended, because they've just got much better tyres than him. And the only thing I'll say there is be interesting if the Mercedes had been the other way around, what Lewis might have been able to do against Lando instead. But again, we'll never know. Maybe it would have been nothing, maybe it would have been something, but it would have been interesting. But there would have been no way that Mercedes would have swapped the two around. And I think Sainz played that perfectly there. And you've got that from the team radio where it shows that was Ferrari definitely improving. They're not quite there yet because even Ferrari were slightly confused by Sainz's strategy, but said like, no, trust me, I know what I'm doing. It's all part of the plan.
Yeah, there was a huge amount of intelligence going into Sainz's sort of strategy and his plan from this one, and whether it was one he had discussed with the team beforehand or one he had sort of built knowing how the team were going to play the strategy is sort of neither here nor there. At the end of the day, he pulled the result out, and it seemed to take a lot from him to sort of coordinate that, and I think that's definitely worth remembering. But yeah, it's a strong Sainz performance, and even if Red Bull goes on to win the remaining however many races of the year, looking back on it, he will be the only driver that was able to beat Red Bull on track this year. And at the end of the day, when you need some sort of a bartering point for a contract down the line, and you can pull up the records from 2023 and go, look, all of that was Red Bull apart from me.
Even 2022, and you go, I got your last 2 wins.
Yeah. And somehow Crofty in the commentary forgot that Sainz had won at Silverstone last year. It was like, that is a first win for Carlos Sainz. And you're like, what happened to Silverstone?
Everybody's just doing that scene from the third Naked Gun film where just head slapping themselves with this guy.
So that was an interesting one.
Likes to win with S's. So he's only got Spain next.
Suzuka.
Yeah.
That's
Sao
all
Paulo.
I'm going to say on that one.
Ooh.
Yeah, Sao Paulo is worth remembering on the list as well.
Spielberg.
Are they all back to back, or have we got...
No, we've got races before Sao Paulo. We've still got Qatar and Austin and Mexico City.
Mexico.
Yeah. So you've got plenty of S's on the list
as well.
He'll start finding his way to work. It's basically sort of picking a letter and winning all the races associated with it. Timo, we'll have your winner next, please.
Quite straightforward, because I don't think we've touched on him briefly, but he didn't get anywhere near as much credit as I think he deserves for this. Oscar Piastri, I mean, obviously buggered up by the qualifying thanks to Lance Stroll, and so cited P17, but up 10 places in Singapore on his debut. That's just outstanding. No, what more do you? There's not much more to say. Then you just wonder what he could have done if he'd been Q3. What kind of a headache he could have given Lando, the Ferraris, the Mercedes. I mean, he fought Max a little bit, but again, he was on a completely different strategy at that point, so there was not too much to gain from it. Whereas if he'd been right up there, that would have been very interesting to see how he would have come into play. And for a rookie, not too shabby at all.
Yeah, a very strong outing for Oscar Piastri. And again, in the unupgraded McLaren, being able to make
Can't
up...
wait to see what he can do with the upgrades in Suzuka. Let's see what he can do with that.
Exactly what we said about him in Austria, then coming into Silverstone. It's that sort of thing of, okay, he understands the car, he's able to make the most of the upgrades, but even when he's not got them, he's still able to really chase down Norris performance-wise and stay on his tail at least. And again, like you said, round Singapore to make up 10 places against your starting position is no mean feat and a testament to his racecraft. So, yeah.
So even if you say that some of it's down to the DNFs, you've still got to remember that it's his first time there, and essentially surviving Singapore is its own reward a lot of the time, especially for drivers more experienced than him. Cough, Lance Stroll, cough. So, you can't really use that argument validly there to try and take some credit away from him. He just did a really, really good job.
Yeah, there's no viable means of discrediting him for that effort. So I'll hop on to my winner, which is Liam Lawson, a pretty obvious one, all things considered. Third ever Formula One race, arguably the most physically demanding race on the calendar. Drivers losing anywhere from 2 kilos and upwards in sweat across the race. That is not something you can just prepare for with sort of 3 races notice. And he's now the 350th driver to score points in Formula One. And crucially, he has scored points now, which makes him the top half of all the drivers AlphaTauri have signed this season. So it's good effort from him.
1 point away from Yuki, which if you're Yuki, you're thinking, yeah. When's Daniel coming back? I need 2 races for him to rubber in so I can just claw out again, maybe just get another couple of points somewhere. Help.
Yeah, that is a lot of pressure.
That was also the only car that hadn't reached Q3 yet. So it's your driver that's stepped in
and he did it by knocking out Verstappen.
Yeah. Yeah, did it by knocking out Verstappen. Albeit Ricardo's only had 2 races, but
Hell, on
yeah,
his third, Lawson was able to win round the hardest circuit on the calendar. There's nothing you can say that sort of adds extra context that even starts to diminish his
You
accomplishment.
don't need to.
Fantastic. And yeah,
You
like you
just
said,
slam that
It's more
fact down on the
trying
table
to-
and go on your way.
I was more trying to save Ricardo than diminish Lawson's, but it's also he's the first driver to get their first ever set of points in Singapore as well.
yeah, first driver to score their sort of debut points at Singapore. Yeah, it's just an all-round sort of one of those mind-boggling performances, and you look at it and go, "Oh, come on, that's really got to put the cat amongst the pigeons at AlphaTauri now when it comes to signing new drivers, because you've got someone who's done sort of an entire year's worth of work for the team in the space of 3 races. That's mind-boggling, and yeah, I think he's also now the 6th New Zealand Kiwi driver to score points in Formula One. So good on him. I think the last was Brendan Hartley. So at least he knows that he can now go on
A
and
little
win them
while.
all.
Also, a Toro Rosso or what were Toro Rosso back then?
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, pretty good stuff there from our winners. But crucially, our spinners. Ellie May will go to you and Aston Martin, because I might have something to add to this one.
It was just a shocking weekend for the team. I mean, obviously, Lance Stroll crashed out in Q1 heavily. And when I saw that car in pieces, obviously, which is meant to do to absorb the shock from the crash rather than the driver taking all that impact, I knew he wouldn't be racing on Sunday. I just, looking at that car, I was like, they don't have enough parts to try and fix that car. But with Lance out, you would think that would mean sort of double the focus on Fernando Alonso, but it was just a messy race from him really as well. Whilst the others could get sort of past the ailing Perez on his old hard tyres, the Aston Martin really struggled, and Fernando himself was sort of sliding around, and then they had that awful pit stop, which lasted, I think it was like 28 and a half seconds. Okay, some of that would have been from the 5-second penalty he had from crossing the pit lane line, but that was an awful stop. And with the pack,
There was a great photo of before and after the pit stop for Alonso, with Alonso in his Renault days being before and Alonso in his Aston Martin gear afterwards, to show how long the pit stop had been, which I thought was quite tongue-in-cheek.
Yeah, and with the pack sort of staying so tightly together, it just pushed him right down to the bottom of the order. And he was running in the points, and now they come away with none. And he's now been overtaken by Lewis Hamilton in the championship, which is the first time we've seen that order move around this year.
And it's the first spin in P3 in the standings since Bahrain last year.
Yeah, this is the first time we've seen that essentially top 3 change since the start of the year. But I will say, to not necessarily clear Aston Martin, who really fumbled that pit stop, but to clear Fernando Alonso, he was driving a crippled car. It had been damaged early on in the race. The rear support...
Perez, by any chance?
It might well have been. I couldn't say for certain, but the rear support on the lower wishbone was broken and cracked. So there was not quite the support on the front left wheel that was needed there. So it wasn't getting the turn in. It wasn't being able to cope with the downforce that was being put through it. So he was driving a crippled car through much of the race, which would explain his hampered race pace, but that and doesn't go anywhere close to explaining what the hell happened to that pit stop. That was a shoddy mess.
You had such an opportunity there, Jesse. You should have said you have no idea what the hell has happened there. Yeah, that doesn't happen very often. You missed that one.
I missed the opportunity for some strong branding there. I do apologise, but yeah, I was too annoyed.
I'm going to have to make you my spinner now. That's just disappointing all round.
Oh, well, your spinner was going to be Alfa Romeo.
I know. And that's mainly because the new PU didn't seem to do much for Zhou. And despite Bottas being on the alternate strategy, it did seem a bit flawed at times. I mean, they didn't capitalise on the safety car when they didn't really have anything to lose by not just doing something different at that stage. I mean, ultimately, it didn't matter anyways. He DNF'd, but it's still not where we want to see the team in this era of Formula One. And they just seem the most forgettable team on the grid at the moment. I mean, we look at that midfield and kind of the lower end of the pack, which is kind of the secondary midfield at times. And you see Williams coming and going. You see Aston Martin and AlphaTauri coming and going. Haas having a good weekend here, for example, but Alpha just seem to be consistently at the back and just kind of in no man's land. And it's disappointing. You don't want to see it. You want to see them at least getting a bit of a tussle every now and again. And, Bottas is a good driver. We know Zhou is capable, and we just don't get to see it. So,
Yeah, very flat weekend from Alfa Romeo, and I thought the fact that they weren't able to really capitalize on that alternate strategy when Red Bull were able to do it, and it wasn't a really sort of tricky strategy to try and piece together. It was a relatively obvious play, especially when that VSC from Ocon was triggered. It was kind of obvious what you needed to do at that point to go for the second stop. But yeah,
you had nothing to lose by doing it because you're already not going to probably get points anyway. So why not risk it for a biscuit?
But at that point, when you've got both your drivers, I can't remember if they're tied on points with anyone at the moment. It just checks list. So Bottas and Zhou. Bottas is on 6. Zhou is on 4. So they aren't tied with anyone, but there's a lot of drivers around them on 3 and 2 points that could risk tying with them come season's end. So that's where you really want to be. Even if you're not getting points, you want to be finishing ahead of them in the races for countback. It could be worth all the points come the end of the season, especially if they're quite close to Haas off the top of my head in the constructors. But I've got to say, my spinner has to be Sergio Perez. While he put up a decent defense against Alonso and Ocon on dead tyres, Alonso got past him in the end with a broken car, and Ocon sort of did 2 for 1 at one point. It was an absolute worldie of a move from the birthday boy.
Oh, nice.
Absolute stuff that we want to see more of from Ocon. Proof that there is a really talented racing driver in there.
Martin Brundle said at one point, I didn't think 2 cars could actually get through that part of the track on like next to each other. It's like, none of us knew that either, Martin. Don't worry.
Ocon did, and I think it's more pay to the fact that Alpine need to buck their ideas up. They've got a relatively decent chassis, but it is majorly outgunned in the power stakes. And unless Vimy and Renault can really step up and make a proper E-Tech unit coming forwards, they need to look at becoming a customer team, because they are unfortunately not producing a power unit that is giving the goods these days. And I think maybe I don't want to say when Ford arrives, because Renault and Ford have had no links previously, but maybe when Cadillac arrives to produce something for Andretti, maybe even look at a Mercedes power unit. They've got to look at something, because at the moment the power unit they're producing is no means good enough, and it's beginning to become the weak point in that team.
I say let's double down on the French affair in Formula One and get Citroën involved, or Peugeot.
Peugeot I could go with. They've had a history in Formula One engines, but I don't think it was particularly good.
Let's get a 2CV engine in that Alpine car. Let's go for it.
Let me tell you, those things not fuss. Anyway, I seem to have gone a bit of an Alpine rant. My entire rant was supposed to be about Sergio Perez, who, despite some decent defence, as soon as he got to attacking, was horrendously messy. He ruined Yuki's race on lap 1, and then absolutely denied Alex Albon a decent finish with a horrendous dive bomb. If you've not seen the footage of it, go and watch it from Albon's point of view, because there's not even a sign of Perez until the very last moment, where you spot the front end of his nose cone barely making it past Albon's rear tyres. That is not having a controlling line into a corner. That is a last minute sort of chuck it and see. And Albon is not the timid racer he was in 2019. He is a far better racer these days, and I don't think he was going to sort of let Perez get away with that. Unfortunately, he sort of overestimated how cautious Perez might have been in that moment, and net result was he was spun around. I think it was coming onto the bridge. But yeah, it was just shocking driving from Perez, really, and should have had more from him.
Yeah.
Let me just say, though, silver lining to everything. The 2 liveries, I didn't get your opinions on them in the Prix because you weren't there, but McLaren, decent shadow livery, but I did quite like the Golf on the Williams car. It did look quite nice, I've got to say, and I'm looking forward to see it again in Japan.
I
preferred McLaren's, which is an unpopular opinion, but I just preferred it. I think because when you look at that Golf livery from the Williams, you're kind of, in the back of my mind, I'm still comparing it to McLaren's.
Yeah, but it was nicer than the McLaren's Golf livery, though.
See, I thought McLaren's was nicer.
You're just a McLaren bias here. That's what's happening.
But no, I kind of had another sort of half winner and spinner. We'd already sort of touched on it. But my other kind of winner would have been Esteban Ocon before sort of the gearbox failure. He was having a pretty good race. He was just getting on with it quietly. Sort of, I guess, apart from that sort of Fernando Alonso, Sergio Perez moment where he saw his opportunity when they were fighting and just took it to pass them both.
It was interesting that it was those two drivers, considering Spa with Perez a few years ago in the Force India, and then obviously Alonso in his time with Alpine. Like, of all the drivers for him to go up against at the same time, it had to be those two.
The two he doesn't have the best track record of overtaking without some sort of collision coming forth. Yeah. Bold one,
And
but
then,
he pulled it off with aplomb.
He did. And it was just such a shame that he didn't get sort of the reward on his birthday as well, which is just...
He did at least get Martin Brundle to wish him happy birthday, even if it was at the expense of an interview with Oscar Piastri.
Yes, that is true. And then I would say it kind of paid out in the end for Verstappen, but I would say for once, my spinner would also be Red Bull strategists. To put them...
Yeah, the safety car pit, for example, was a bit curious because they knew they were going to get attacked straight away afterwards, that surely.
Well, I guess it was a case of they couldn't have gone on the hards because they were already on the hards, and the mediums wouldn't have lasted that long, so they would have had to have pitted again. With them both so sort of far back, I was surprised that they didn't go on softs, and then sort of, obviously then with the softs and everyone being on mediums around them, they would hopefully then be able to get a few in front of a few cars at the start of the race with better grip. And then usually you kind of gamble on the fact that the safety car is usually going to come out early. So then you would have been able to pit on those softs, and then you would have been on the same strategy as everyone else, but you would have been higher up. Or at least split your strategy. Split what way you're going to go. One start on soft, one start on hard. So you've got a fallback for however sort of the race pans out. I just thought, I don't know. I was just surprised the way they sort of went with things throughout the race, really.
I think Red Bull knew this was going to be their sort of dummy race and opted to not play anything too risky, too dangerous. They just thought, if we walk away from this with points, we're happy. But the fact that they didn't even opt for a split strategy really shows how little confidence they had coming into the race based off of what they'd learned in practice and qualifying. They did not have high expectations and just simply went for the straightest, cleanest cut. They obviously knew there was the chance for the second stop under a later safety car, but they basically came into this with a plan and said, look, we've got 15 races won in a row at this point in time as a team. Max has just won 10 in a row as a driver. We've set records on both sides of that. At this point, let's just focus on getting as many points as we can from what's ultimately not going to be our strongest race weekend and go from there.
But if you look back at this year, even just this year, and the people that have decided to take the gamble and start on hards and go long, I can't think of any team that's played out for. It's always pretty much hindered them. So wouldn't you have just taken that gamble and gone on the softs instead?
Maybe you should be the new Red Bull strategist, Ellie May. That's what I'm hearing.
I know.
The only thing I'm
I
thinking
think
is that Red Bull struggles turning its tyres on. It's very delicate with them. And I think what it didn't want is to end up outlasting its softs in a weird way. It knew with the hards it could go on and there was going to be an ever-increasing chance of that safety car. So it would then get to pit later and swap to the mediums. If it was on the softs, it would possibly have to pit early or risk overshooting that prime pit window under a possible safety car in that first stint. So it was a tricky one to call, but the fact they didn't go for the split strategy still remains the weirder part of it. I think we've sort of covered.
Move on to predictions, though, I think. And it was not a great affair for most of us, let's face it. No one scored
I
for
didn't
pole.
make any.
Well, that did hinder you, to be fair.
Yeah, that will hinder me. But also, you guys, that was your opportunity to get a load of points.
Oh, no, that's what I was going to say. It was our opportunity, and we did not take it at all.
Yeah, we plundered that.
No one scored for pole with predictions split between Verstappen and Perez. You could see where we were thinking, but oops. Podium-wise, I got nothing. Jesse, I'm not sure if we're going to count your Sainz win because you did put it in after the preview had been recorded. I did check the timing stamps on that one, and we had finished recording by that point.
Yeah, but I put it in before the race started. In fact, I think I put it in on like the Friday or something.
But when I've done it before we finished recording the preview normally, then it doesn't count there.
I don't think you've done that this season, so that's a moot point. But the fact of the matter is that...
Is it?
It is a moot point. The fact is that...
So if I just don't do any if I don't do any predictions when we record the Japanese Grand Prix preview, but I do it before qualifying, it's still going to be fine, is it? Yeah, I've got you on record for saying that.
No, it has to be in before the first track session, which is what I did with my predictions. I had my predictions in before FP1 kicked off, so I had no clue on track form.
Funny how that has never come up as something that you wanted to make clear previous, but okay.
Well, this is the first time it's
you
come
didn't.
up.
That's the only point that you. Well, it's the only point you got anyway, so I didn't really do much for you because you've got nothing else. Nathan and Jonathan, the guests from last week, got nothing for Nathan, but Jonathan did pick up a point for Hamilton P3 and another point for a fastest lap with Hamilton. No one else got anything else, and none of us got our wild predictions. So successful outing all done there. So you're still probably quite safe out front.
Yeah, and do you know what the lesson is from this?
Make better predictions.
Well, yes, and also the weekend that I obviously hampered myself, but it was a bad weekend for me. It was a bad weekend for Red Bull.
Yeah, or the weekend that you don't make predictions, it's an exciting race.
Can we try something for Japan, Ellie Mae?
It's like if no one has listened to the Goodwood Revival review, any car that I took a picture of at Goodwood Revival would almost on the first lap would immediately retire.
You're the Nico Rosberg in training is what you are.
Yeah.
Yes, I am. Even if I was really looking forward to one of the races, like the Lavant Cup, which had the Ferrari 250s in it was mainly plagued with safety car. They had to add
Ferrari
3
don't
minutes
normally need your help
race.
with doing badly anyway, so I feel like that was just cruel on your part.
They had to add 3 minutes onto the race to try and actually get some racing action. So I am very good at...
Yeah, the curse of Ellie Mae goes on in a weird regard.
Yeah.
F1 fantasy-wise, though, for Singapore, we had some familiar names out front for the race itself, with Francisco Rhodes 2 out in front with 270 points, Francisco Rhodes 1 with 250 points, and Alex H9V2 in third with 233 points. Behind them, though, it got a bit interesting because, amazingly, despite me not touching this team since before Bahrain, the Nitro RX podcast team came in P8 with 214 points. EMT Racing P10 with 204 on the curbs and P13 somehow with 887 points. Although as I was saying to you, Jesse, before we recorded, I did choose my no negative scoring chip to play for this weekend, and that was very lucky of me as I had Verstappen and Alonso in my team. BRT Yamaha then P15 with 157 points. Overall, though, we've got Alex H9V2 out in front with 4,421 points. Francisco Rhodes, just as it is, in second place with 4,409 points. And Lecresse is making an appearance in third with 4,262 points. Ellie Mae, you're still ahead of the rest of us in our little team battle there. That's not too surprising, though. You're in P9 with 3,862 points. Midbeds Racing P10, 3,627 points. On the curbs, P12, slowly but surely, but pretty much just slowly coming up to the rear gun there, and 3,353 points. And Experiment Underdog is still firmly in P33 of 33 with 1,322 points. So mixed bag overall, but also kind of business as usual because Ellie Mae does what Ellie Mae does.
Yeah, pretty standard stuff there. No need really for a constructors countdown, I'll say at this point, because there hasn't been a change in constructors, and we've already mentioned very much the shuffling order of the drivers. But it is worth noting that, again, we have a race weekend where the positions change. Liam Lawson now up to P19 in the standings, so now ahead of Sargent, ahead of De Vries, and ahead of Ricciardo. We've already mentioned at the top that Hamilton and Alonso swap places P3, P4, and Piastri now overtakes Ocon for P11. So a little bit of a change there as the McLarens go sort of hunting to surge away from Alpine.
Do you two have any final points you want to make before we finish the Singapore Grand Prix review?
Next year, I'd like to go along and do some live coverage from it. How's that for a thought?
I think
we'd be on board with that as well.
One of my goals to go there, just Singapore in general, but
we'll see what we can do about that for next year.
Yeah. Also, if anybody wants to donate to, do we have a Patreon? We do have a Patreon.
We do have a Patreon, yeah.
Yeah, if anyone wants to help fund, basically two collections.
May go into Singapore.
No, that can be for later. Nigel Mansell is having a huge sort out. So there's a huge Nigel Mansell collection going up for auction.
It's a big auction.
And there are some couple of items that I would really like. They're not that expensive. So there's a couple. So there's basically, it's predicted or estimated between £100 and £200 for 4 John Player Special bomber jackets. I say,
that actually,
it's pretty cool. There's also 2 Williams ski jackets, I think estimated to be about the same as well. I would really like them. And also, if you could also stretch to the fact that I really want a Lola T70 coupe. There is one for sale. It doesn't say how much, so
that's not a good sign.
No, it has won the Le Mans Classic 3 times.
I'm going to say that might be more than a couple £100.
If Madam has to ask, Madam can't afford.
So if you would like to fund my shopping habits.
What do you use your Patreon for, Undercut Podcast? Do you use it to try and improve the podcast? No, we just buy Ellie Mae Nigel Mansell merch. And maybe a car.
But imagine turning up to go.
You say the Singapore Grand Prix wearing a Nigel Mansell skiing jacket, you're going to absolutely melt.
No, I was going to say attending a race, watching our dominant Lola T70 go around, I don't know, Masters Sports Legends. And we're all in matching John Player special jackets. We will look so cool.
With one exception, we all have to grow moustaches as well to go with them, so we can really channel our inner Nigel Mansells.
I can do that.
Yeah, I can probably go for that.
There is actually a Nigel Mansell Lotus that goes around Masters Historic as well.
Yeah, one of the old 78s.
Yeah.
Yeah. I shouldn't have got into classic racing if I knew it was going to be this expensive.
Look at the monster you've created. That is all we have time for on this week's episode, though, and is all we're going to be talking about for the Singapore Grand Prix and Nigel Mansell, but probably more on Nigel Mansell later on because Ellie Mae's here. In the meantime, though, Jesse, where can the people find you?
You can find me on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok as @JesseOnCars. You can probably find me on YouTube, where I haven't made anything new for well over a year and a bit now. And you can find me writing for Classic Car Weekly, where at the time of recording, and no doubt at the time of release, you could probably still pick up the last of our Goodwood editions, which has my road test of a Shelby Cobra in it and all of the live Goodwood coverage. If not, you can pick up the next one, which has a road test of the Ford Lotus Cortina.
Ellie Mae, where can the people find yourself?
I will constantly be updating the Sotheby's auction website page, just constantly hoping that I've bought the entire collection of Nigel Mansell.
Fair enough. As for myself, you can find me over on The Curbs, the Nitro RX podcast, Paddock Sorority, Instagram, and Is It Fast, where I have a brand new article out reviewing the BBC documentary Fast Track to Glory, which if any of you in the UK are listening to this, you should go and check that out. If you've got a spare half an hour, it's well worth a watch. That is all we have time for, though, as we said, so please let us know any of your thoughts for this week's episode in the comments below, and we'll be back soon for a preview episode for the Japanese Grand Prix.